came out. I was out and said I'm a queer artist, and at that time it was not a normal thing, and I would say, interestingly, it's still an issue. And basically, therefore, I became a spokesperson. So though people might not realize it, it wasn't really my goal to be a spokesperson, but it's merely, if there aren't very many people out and speaking, and who are willing to speak and enjoy speaking about themselves as gay people and their experiences, those people will be asked, because there's such a small pool to choose from, because so many people are not out, and that's still true today, I think. Maybe more people have come out, but it's still an issue. So when they need someone to talk about gay stuff, they would call me. So I'd end up being like spokesperson, because I was the only gay guy out saying, hey, I'm gay and I really enjoy being gay. And never mind the fact that my opinions were quite outrageous, and I feel I'm just like being honest about my life, but that I think was a rarity. I think to some degree still is. So I just wanted to say that my work, and my work just uses, is on gay topics. Like it's about plays and novels and poems about gay relationships. I'm primarily focused on that, and it's not something which I try to do. It's something which I have just happens because that's my life, and I write about my life. And but that also means that I become an activist in the sense that my work, people start asking about the subject matter of my work. But I will say that I honestly think that basically, how can I express this? I think that gay liberation is basically over. I've written about this. And I think, unfortunately, you know, to some degree, queer liberation, though I very much support this idea of kind of queer politics, it's a tough battle, and I wish you luck, because I don't think there's much support out there in the gay and lesbian community. There may be support in the trans community, but not much in the gay and lesbian community anymore. And so my work basically is kind of, like my work is not over. I continue doing my writing on these subjects, but whereas before I used to get I didn't get a lot of support, but at least had interest in my work from the gay and lesbian community, and my work was kind of controversial, and but it was considered, like, there was a reason to have gay and lesbian work, and there was a reason to have gay and lesbian politics, and to speak out on these issues. But now from the community, I get the feeling basically that they're not interested not only in me, but in anybody who, I don't take it personally, but in anybody who really wants to speak out about gay and lesbian or queer issues. I would say gay and lesbian people are not interested, basically. So it's an uphill battle. So the activism, so I moved out of Toronto. One of the many reasons I moved out was because I thought it would be interesting to be in a town, my partner and I thought it would be interesting to be in a town where, Hamilton, where we could begin to, where their gay liberation was actually important, because people it might affect their lives in a very strong way, because they're having trouble being out and all of that. Whereas in Toronto, it's so upscale, and it's so middle class, and and there's so much money here, and so people have sort of gotten away from the ideas of gay and lesbian and queer liberation, in my view. So that's what I have to say about myself and activism. Is I still do it, but nobody's really very interested. That's how it works.
Okay, so I'm going to just, you mentioned last night, it was UG.
Okay, all right. I'm just looking at the questions, because I think you moved on to some of the other questions already, so I don't want to repeat here.
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, I may have, but I tried to keep them.
Sense that when I go home to visit, I have my parents there, I have siblings there in the surrounding area. There's like that blue collar feel.
Yeah.
There, like I take the bus a little bit. I can just look around and see that this is, you're not in Toronto. I mean,
You never grew up in
No.
I grew up in Hamilton, so I hate Hamilton.
Oh no, that's why I'm saying it's. But that's why I'm saying it's really different.
But it isn't pretty.
When you go back and visit, that's what I meant. When you go back and visit, like, it's fun for us, but we don't come from there. I can understand why people move.
It was a horrible sleepover.
Oh,
it was
sure
hard.
it was. No, I'm sure it was. I mean, not only is there so much poverty, but I'm sure there was.
I'm sure that, like you're saying, things are probably different with people.
I mean, it's different. I mean, it's different. I mean, it's also becoming culturally mixed. Like we live in a heavy-duty Somali neighborhood, you know. So I mean, they have a lot of mixture, which used to be just white, and that's changing too. So.
Oh, you are? Okay, that's great. So you did start into the second question, but I'm going to ask it again, because there's especially the end piece of it. I'm sure you can get more specific about that. Is you share with us experiences in brackets here, activist, academic, artistic, so you cross the lines in all those, that you've had that you think is significant for how we think about queer liberation as theory or practice?
Well, for me, I mean, the biggest event for me would be, when you put it that way, would be when I was running, I founded Buddies in Bad Times Theatre in Toronto, and which is again lesbian theatre, many years ago, and I remember very distinctly, and it was probably the early 90s, I don't remember when distinctly, but I remember this happening, that we used to have floats where we would get all dressed up, men and women, in drag, perform, you know, faux sexual acts on the thing, and the little marshals came by very specifically and said there will be no S&M activities on these floats, and like people would be whipped on our floats, or there was a very famous float where and this would be iconic, there's photos of this, where I was dressed as a sailor and I was going down on a woman who had a large dildo, and I did that on the float. And I think it's interesting, it's kind of an iconic photo because you just won't see that anymore. And it was in the name of family, it was the name of making it family accessible pride, and I think that's iconic. I think that says a lot about our community and what happened in our community. And after that, I became less and less interested in attending Pride or being a part of Pride because it wasn't reflecting who I was, right? So yeah, because generally I do think that that the gay and lesbian community is not really interested in gay and lesbian or queer politics anymore, or they want to assimilate. So.
Sorry,
they want to assimilate. Mm-hmm. They're not interested in their difference, they're interested in their sameness, their similarity.
Just as a side note, I want to say this. That whole mess around Quia and Pride and where it was going in the last couple of years, I actually remember that I've never actually watched Pride. I had heard about the Buddies float back when that happened. There was a lot of talk on the whole bit, and I drew it up as an example of some of the changes that had happened, and I was kind of saddened that nobody else was raising it.
Nobody's interested. People are very happy not to have that image in the parade.
And
they don't want to see that unpleasantness. Gay and lesbian people don't want to see that. No.
Okay. How would you define your role in the queer movement?
I don't know.
And that could be past, it could be present.
But I don't think that's a question I put down.
Oh no, that's one of the mandated ones that we're asking.
Oh, you have to ask.
Yeah.
My role in the queer movement, I would say I was shit kicker, I was noisemaker, I was the person everyone hated. So I've been out as a promiscuous person, as a drag queen, and I also came out with some radical views around HIV/AIDS, and all of these things made me very much hated. I see those three things have a lot to do with me being hated by a lot of gay men and some lesbians. But I know that I have fans of my work, but I also have, in terms of, I've written a lot of essays, and partially because I'm a writer and partially because I was interviewed about my work. And as I say, the activism was kind of a sidebar for me, but my opinions made me very unpopular and caused a lot of anger against me because as people became more conservative in the late 80s and early 90s, and as AIDS began to take its effect on the community in terms of their attitude to morality and or at least to what they profess to be the morality. I don't know if AIDS has really changed as much the way we act as the way we talk about the way we act. But at any rate, I was definitely a pariah on many subjects. Like it was like, he should shut up and go away. So, yeah, I mean, I think I'm the person they call upon, like you're calling on me. I'm the person who they call upon when people are interested in talking about gay or lesbian or queer liberation or pro-sex or gender play or drag or any of the things that I'm associated with, or perhaps if anybody's ever interested in talking about radical HIV, which they hardly ever are these days, then I am called upon. But that's my role. And it's just that my role is less and less. I mean, I wrote an essay in the Globe and Mail a couple of years ago. That's the last really big gay essay I wrote in a mainstream paper that was called, where I said that I quit being gay. And it was basically nothing to do with quit having sex with men, which I am very happy to continue. But it was about saying this gay culture is not my culture anymore, because it's a culture of marriage and being a good citizen and going to church and being the same as middle class white straight people, and I'm not interested in, those are not my values. So I quit that. So my role is still shit kicker, basically.
So let me go off script for a second, because I find that really interesting. And I get what you're saying about, you know, not being gay, because you can't relate to the current gay culture.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ascribe to the term queer? And if so,
Well, I like
what
yeah.
is that to you?
No, I like the term queer. I think it's great, and that was sort of the next question. But yeah, I think the term queer is a great term, and I much prefer to talk about myself as a queer person. When I read how you define queer liberation, the only difference I would have with it is that I think sort of a twofold is where emphasis is. I would stress sex as more or as much as possible, in the sense that being pro-sex and the idea of sexual liberation, meaning that people realize themselves through their sexuality, which is different than realizing yourself through love or through marriage. It doesn't mean that they can't be an aspect of love or marriage, but definitely it's a separate topic. Sex doesn't always come with love or marriage. It's just sex and sexuality is something that is an important part. Sex, really. Like sexuality means more like gender, or sexual choices, excuse me. It doesn't mean gender means sexual choices, but sex is sex, sexual acts. And sexual liberation was about the idea of people, in the 60s, it was the philosophy and notion, which didn't tend to always be pro-gay or lesbian, but in principle it was the idea that people realize themselves through their sex, through sexual acts, and through liberating themselves and becoming uninhibited and having lots of sex, or having sex, period. So there's that aspect of it. The other aspect that where I think you can put more emphasis on that in the definition of queer. The other place where I think I disagree with your definition of queer liberation is that I think we really have to get out of the civil rights thing. Like, I mean, I think it's fine. I mean, not that we have to get out of it, but we just have to stop worrying about it, because it doesn't do anything. Like, civil rights are basically just, they're there. Look at women. Women have the right to abortion, right, in, I guess, United States and Canada. But has it helped? Yes, it's good that it's there, but has it actually changed opinions about women, feminism, or people who hate abortions? Has it meant that fewer people are more, does it mean that middle America is more pro-women or pro-feminism, or understands abortion and why women have them? No. In fact, what abortion has done is what abortion rights have done is polarized. That doesn't mean we shouldn't go for those rights, but it means we set too much store by civil rights. To me, there's two ways of looking at queer liberation. One is, when we get our rights, everything is okay. That's what I disagree with. And the other one is, rights are an adjunct, they're nice, whatever, but they're actually almost a smokescreen, because people go, oh great, they have their rights, can they now shut up? And the real issue is what goes on in people's minds, and prejudices and ideas about gender and sex, and that has to be confronted, and that's a long road. It's not going to be confronted tomorrow. It's a huge road, but the rights is just, my problem with any sort of modern liberation, including what I read in your queer liberation thing, though I do admire what you're doing, is that it sets so much store by civil rights, because we can get gay marriage, and it's not going to change anything other than the fact that we can get married. But if anything, it's going to increase hatred of gay people if gay marriage gets more legalized. And not saying not to do it. I'm not saying that one shouldn't do it for that reason. One should do it, have gay marriage, but don't imagine that it means that people think better of us because we're married. In fact, people go, oh my God, I hate them more now because they're starting to come into our territory and ruin our marriage. That's what happens when you have gay marriage.
Great, okay.
And it's also very important to realize that we live in a bubble, okay? We live in a Church Street bubble. As soon as you go to Hamilton, where I live, it's different. Try going to Saudi Arabia. Try going to Salt Lake City. Try going to Ohio, in the woodlands of Ohio, or Tennessee or something. What I'm saying is that the religious right and the conservative movements, really religious fundamentalism is basically the issue. But as soon as you get out of the bubble that we live in, we imagine that people like us. No, the world does not like homosexuals. Outside of the Church Street bubble, there's a lot of negativity about queers and trans and all of that, and that's very important to remember.
Okay, that's great. So we're going to get to, I think you've been waiting for this, part on definitions. These are still mandated questions. How would you define queer liberation?
Well, I mean, to me, queer liberation would have to do with really two basic things. Like I would call them like sexual liberation and gender liberation. So it would have to me, those are the two cornerstones of gay liberation, which I would just prefer to call queer liberation now. But yeah, and that means that we realize that all gender is, that identity is play, and that gender is play, and that gender is choice, and that identity, though important, is something which we can play with and take on or put off as we please, and is not necessarily related to sexuality. So that means that men can be feminine, women can be masculine, or whatever, and all of the various categories in between men and women and masculine and feminine. And the other major tenet is that people be encouraged to realize themselves through sex, through sexual acts, through sexual activity. That, and I would say not connected with love, but to me, every consensual sexual act is an act of love. So when you talk about, but the problem is I'm not going to talk about it as love, because then people will say, oh, you mean hugging. No, I mean sex. So I'm talking about sex, but I'm talking about it separate from love, because it isn't, I don't want people to say they have to me, queer liberation isn't about liberating yourself through hugging or loving. It's about liberating yourself through sex, which actually is love, if it's consensual.
Great. And how, this is the last mandated question, how is queer liberation expressed in your activism, art, theory?
Well, basically, queer liberation is expressed in my theory because I write about my own life, and I don't mean that I write specifically about it. My work isn't autobiographical in that sense, but like any writer, I use my own personal experiences, and I don't change them over into heterosexual experiences, and I don't change them over sexual experiences into non-sexual experiences. So I write about sex, and I write about same-sex sex, and I write about effeminate men, because that's my experience, being somewhat effeminate and knowing a lot of effeminate men. So I write about my experience and put it out there, and that makes me my work extremely political and extremely challenging for people. So that's where, I can't remember the question, but that's where.
How is queer liberation expressed?
Yes, that's how it's expressed, is by writing about not perhaps the personal details, but writing about the personal details of my community, which means my life in the community.
Okay, we move on to the questions that you've chosen. And the first category is history. And you've chosen the first question to be, what can queer liberation is learned by looking at our past?
Well, I think the most important thing we can learn is if we look at the people who were at Stonewall. So if we look at the people who were at Stonewall, and those were the people who I think were quite representative of pre-Stonewall queerness, we see a lot of drag queens and trans people, okay? There's lots of arguments about who was there, but it seems to be basically, and hookers, but it seems to be basically sex trade workers. It seems to be basically suggested that those were a huge proportion of the people that were there. And I think that if you look at the early gay liberation marches, you will see posters in Toronto's marches, for instance, that say things like, I don't know, I'm a pansy, or I can't remember what the words are, but they're words that express the idea of being a feminine gay man, a girly boy, whatever, proudly that. So I think what we can learn about is about gender. And basically, the early gay liberation was a lot to do with gender bending, and the leaders of it were butch dykes and feminine, dykes on bikes basically, stone butches, and feminine men. And that's because they were visible, and they had no choice but to be out, and that's still the case. That hasn't changed much. The people who are likely to be out are the people who have to be out. If you go to like a teen rainbow school and you look at the kids that are there will probably be feminine trans students or feminine boys and masculine girls, because they're the ones who read as being different. If kids can hide it, they'll often hide it as long as they can. So anyway, what we have to look at in the past, in the gay liberation movement, is that our forebears were gender, they would be classified by the DSM as gender dysphoric, because now we have to realize that as soon as homosexuality was removed from the DSM, they brought in gender dysphoria, right? Which means that children, if you have a little boy who plays with dolls, you take that little boy quite possibly has a mental illness. And you can take that. Now, of course, all this is good because trans people can get money from the government through this kind of situation. But it's bad, in my view, from the point of view that you've pathologized gender dysphoria as an illness, right? And I don't think it is an illness. I don't think there's such an illness, just like there wasn't an illness of homosexuality. But it just shows you the potency of our cultural fears about gender, which I sometimes think are actually sometimes I think it's more frightening to people to see a feminine man than to see a man taking it up the butt. Honestly. Or, sorry, taking it up the butt would be bad because that's feminine. To see a man fucking another man is not as threatening as to see a man being feminine or taking it up the butt, which is considered feminine. So all of our insecurity, a lot of our insecurity around sexuality has to do with gender. And the fear of what happens when you play with gender roles, when men are no longer men and women are no longer women. And of course that goes back to long cultural things of begat, breeding. You have to have heterosexuality. God help us if heterosexuality were to disappear. What I often say to my sexuality classes is heterosexuality is not liable to disappear. So no matter how much I sit here and talk to you about how wonderful it is to be gay, because one of the big arguments from the extreme right is, what if the whole world was gay? There would never be any children. And it's like, and they're so insecure, those heterosexuals. But in fact, heterosexuality is not, unfortunately, ever going to go away. The strangeness and oddness and screwed upness of it will remain, right? Forever, I think. So I've gotten off onto a lot of topics there, but yeah.
Says so.
That's great. Okay, also under history, you've chosen, were there elements the gay liberation movement developed as being uniquely its own?
Yeah, the three things that I talk about as being queer culture are gender play, I call it, camp, and the third thing would be alternative relationships. And so those are a nice way of saying three different things, well, two things. For instance, gender play means basically that people are free to be whatever, to act in any way they want to, regardless of their the gender they were born with, identified with as biological when they were born. And that gender and sexuality aren't mixed up together. So men can be, the idea that men can be feminine, women can be masculine is a major aspect of queer culture. And one of the things we have to offer to straight culture that they can learn from us and that we're of great value to them if they're willing to listen. The second thing I said was camp, and basically that's our culture, which is our wit, which is basically our way of dealing with prejudice and hate and fear, is to have a sense of humor about it and to use self-deprecation, which is often misunderstood, of course, as being a bad thing. But there's a lot of interesting new writing which I would direct you towards now, which you've probably heard of, about gay shame. And the whole philosophy of gay shame, which I find very interesting, is learning to embrace shame, or David Halpern talks about it in terms of the abject, and he talks about Genet. So it has a lot to do with, one of the major contributions of queer culture up to now has to be finding the holiness of abjection, which means the beauty of outsiderness and abjection. And rather than trying not to be different or being ashamed of being ashamed, it's kind of somehow learning to revel in that shame and to find your identity, a positive identity in shame. Because we're all ashamed, and there's a lot of theories about shame and the act, if you read the book about the shame itself and how it works. So at any rate, camp comes out of that, comes out of our shame, and it's the kind of wounding wit, which is both funny and tragic at the same time, which comes from, it's not completely unlike Jewish wit, but it's a little bit different because both come out of minority status, but of course they're different because being Jewish is different than being gay, but, but there are similarities, and they both, in the sense that they both come out of dealing with that abjectness, that being othered, being different. Then finally there's what I call alternative relationships, which is a great euphemism, but trying to cover things like the idea of promiscuity, polyandry, the idea of having multiple sexual partners, having sexual friendships with people, having many different partners at the same time, you know, all this, whatever you want to, and you know, the mind boggles at the number of the possibilities, which are as varied as the people are varied for how people can relate and interrelate. But that's, in my view, the way people were made to be, and there's very few people who are made to be monogamous, which in my definition is you only have one sex with one person for your entire life. If you've ever had sex with another person, after that person dies, you're not monogamous anymore, okay? The only monogamous people are those little Italian ladies who, when their husband dies, they wear the black, right? And then they never have anyone else in their life. Those are monogamous. Congratulations, ladies, you're doing it. But for other people, as soon as you have sex with more than one person in your life, you're not monogamous. So my theory is that not very many people are cut out to be little Italian ladies, though everyone seems to aspire to be that for some strange reason. So yeah, so that's what I mean by alternative relationships. And those are the three wonderful gifts we have to offer to heterosexual culture. And they ignore those gifts at their peril, in the sense that I think their culture is bereft and lacking and sad without those things. But anyway, that's what we have to offer.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay. So we're now moving to the next category. You've chosen all three questions under dissension. So the first
Yes.
one is...
Oh, yeah, I thought this was a funny question. Go ahead.
Are dissident voices threatening, and do you consider queer liberationism radical?
Yes. Dissenting voices are threatening. And the problem is that we, and I found this question very funny, of asking us whether or not queer liberation or threatening voices was radical, because I think that basically we live in a very conservative age and people don't want to be radical, right? And people don't like anything radical. Even the Tea Party has to be very careful that they're not labeled as radical. That would be a bad thing to be radical, right, for anyone. Everyone wants to be middle of the road. And as a friend of mine said, a middle of the road is where you get run over. So that's something important to remember. But, so in my view, radical things are great, but they're not popular right now. So if queer, but it's very important that queer is going to shake people up. And if you say the kind of things that I've been talking about, if you talk about the importance of the positives of sex or promiscuity, or the positives of gender play, and if you talk about that kind of thing, people will be insecure and people will be threatened. And that's what it's all about. It's not that you want to threaten them, it's just that if you're going to say these ideas, you must accept the fact that it deeply threatens the status quo. I would say the idea of men acting in a feminine way, people who have penises, if they act femininely, that is threatening to heterosexual culture in a major way, okay? It goes back, because I've done research into this, it goes back to what I would call the effeminatus, which has been written about by scholars, which would be the image of the effeminate warrior, which you find this in Shakespeare, and you find this going back to medieval sort of culture. It's very interesting, this notion that the country will be threatened if the warrior, if there are not warriors. So, and it's the same old thing as what if everybody turned gay? Well, it's like, what if all the warriors were gone and no one was here to defend us because all the men were feminine? Because of course the women defending us is not possible or conceivable in this kind of old-fashioned sexuality. So, so I'm just trying to give you an idea of how firmly based in our culture this fear of male femininity is. And I think there's a fear of female masculinity. It's just that it's a little less threatening, and I don't know how to say this politely, but because women don't matter as much in our culture. And I mean that our culture is sexist. So what women do, if women are masculine or not, we let them fool around, right? But men who are in charge of the culture, what if George Bush was a girly boy? What if he was not willing to be a warrior? What if Obama was not a real man? You know, what if Stephen Harper could not defend our country? And I don't think really that there's any, that I think feminine men can defend all sorts of things. But that's not the way the culture looks at it or the way the culture works. And I'm trying to indicate what is, I'm not saying that nowadays we're worried necessarily consciously that maybe Stephen Harper will put on a dress and not be able to hold a gun. But what is inscribed into us by years and years is this fear of the feminine male. So when you, that's just an example of when you threaten that, yes, you threaten a lot, which is why a lot of gay people like to go around going, oh, you know, we don't really like the feminine ones, we don't like the drag queens, we want trans people to be completely invisible as trans people, we want them to be, you know, we want them to be only men, heterosexual men, or you know, heterosexual women, feminine women. Like we don't want trans people in them. We don't want anybody in the middle. We don't want anybody that threatens these categories, right? That are rigid, right? And gay people, I think, in the last, really since the late '80s, gay people have been trying to. Gay men have been trying to become more masculine, been trying to present themselves in a more masculine way. The Clone was really the first big, and Tom of Finland was the first big moment of, hey, we can be masculine. And gay men were so happy that they could present themselves in a masculine way. But it comes out of a deep fear of femininity in the culture around men. Anyway, so basically my philosophy is that yes, be radical, be threatening. That's what queer liberation is. And if you're afraid of being threatening, then you're not going to change anything or improve people or, you know, change things, basically.
Okay. And next question in this category is, are there contemporary issues that threaten queer liberation? We offer a series of examples. You can speak to any of these or others that you're concerned about. So some of the examples we give are same-sex marriage, corporatization, mainstreaming of LGBTQ culture, pride celebrations, postmodernist notions of sexuality and gender identity, and identity politics.
Well, I think it's pretty funny that anyone would imagine that identity politics threatens sexual liberation. Just let me say something about identity politics, okay? You have to understand that people must have identities. However, they're silly and they're stupid and they're ephemeral and they're magic and they're art and they're play, but they're very important. So this is the weird thing people can't get. It's either because those people who are against identity, they imagine that they're going to stop people from having identities. It's not going to happen. I mean, it's important that I'm Polish. I'm not Polish, but you know what I mean? Important I'm Polish, important that I'm Jewish, it's important that I'm black, it's important that I'm gay. I have sex with men, whatever. These identities we create for ourselves, you will never live in my view, the original goal of gay liberation was to get rid of identities. That's inscribed in gay liberation. That was way back. It was wrong. It isn't going to work, right? Even in an ideal world, people like to say, I was born on that corner, and like all the people born on that corner, we like chocolate ice cream. They like identities, right? The problem is things like nationalism, well, not national, I guess the more proper term would be patriotism and fascism and around identity, because there's fascism around identity, which means that I'll tell you what gay is, and you're not gay because you're not part of that group, and you're not a part of our group, or, you know what I mean? Or queer people won't let trans people in or whatever. When the identities become fascistic and they're no longer play, they're no longer fun, and they're no longer part of the magic of how we view ourselves, but they become rules. And this is what, you know, basically what Judith Butler talks about how she has a conflicted relationship with identity, which is the way we should talk about it, which means we love it and we hate it. It doesn't mean that we don't like it, because frankly, we're not going to get rid of it. So I think it's really quite funny and a bit tragic that identity would be on those lists of something that threatens queer liberation, because you're just not going to get rid of it. What I wonder about two things that are not on that list, the two things that the main thing which threatens queer liberation right now is just basically the conservative backlash, the fact that it's all about home and family nowadays, and it's all about religion and good citizenship, and it's not about difference or exploration or self-realization or experimentation or growing and changing as an individual. It's about conforming and about trying to be a model citizen. And to me, everybody should be a good citizen. Like, we should all obey the traffic lights. I don't consider good citizenship like, was that a big right wing? Like the various, I can't remember the name right now, but the various right-wing gay guys, they consider good citizenship, they go on about how wonderful it is gays to be good citizens. And I go, everybody should be a good citizen. But what really is a goal is to be someone that explores human boundaries, that explores their own self, that explores possibilities for relationships. That's something that we should value. But the other thing that threatens queer liberation is not on this list, and I'm very surprised that no one seems to be talking about it, is the criminalization of HIV. The criminalization of HIV is a huge issue. I mean, they had something in the paper the other day how there's some guy with herpes was being possibly put, he may have to have jail time because he was spreading herpes. Of course, the way they're saying, well, he shouldn't have, he's heterosexual, of course, and they're saying the way that the reason why he shouldn't be put in jail is because herpes isn't life-threatening. Well, in fact, AIDS isn't life-threatening, certainly not the way it used to be. It's quite a manageable chronic illness these days. Yes, it can be life-threatening, and so could herpes. Could look at anything. But I mean, these crazy things. Basically, HIV is basically now, people don't like to talk about it, but basically it's a manageable illness. And it's like getting prostate cancer. You've got something which may kill you at one point, but you'll probably very well be dead from something else before it kills you. So, so why suddenly are people being put in jail as if they're carrying a loaded gun, right? If they have sex with somebody, and I of course think that people who have sex with people and don't tell them their status and infect people randomly with HIV are bad people, but I do not think that they should be put in jail, and I don't think that solves anything. And I think ultimately it's about homophobia, and it's about fear of sex, and it's about, I mean, I just saw the movie Contagion last night. And guess what was the cause of this giant epidemic? Two things. A woman, poor little Gwyneth Paltrow, was patient zero in Contagion. So we all know that women are at the center of these disease issues. And she was a bad woman. She was eating foreign food, and then she went out and had an affair with someone who was not her husband. And she was patient zero in this. I'm just throwing that out there as saying the amount of mythology around illness and that has to do, in general, that is related to the mythologizing of HIV. It's horrible. But at any rate, just in a practical way, yes, we will. How can we express our sexuality if we're being policed and we're afraid of going to jail for being promiscuous? Because basically the way the law looks at it is, we're gay, we might have HIV, we better monitor them because if they're promiscuous, they'll be spreading HIV. So we become criminals. It's going to be eventually, if it continues the way it's going now, that promiscuous gay men are potentially criminals and will be viewed that way. So the criminalization of HIV is extremely serious and can only drive any sensible queer person to be very quiet about their HIV status, to not discuss sex or sexuality or their sexual habits, and to not go to a doctor. Like, that's what I would recommend right now to gay men, is to not talk to a doctor about your sexual life. Listen to me, gay men. Don't talk to your doctor about your sexual activities or habits, because it could get you in legal trouble. And definitely keep very quiet. Do not discuss your sex or sex life with other men. Don't tell them your status, and don't tell them anything, because as soon as you tell another gay man your status that shows you to be positive, he can put you in jail for infecting him. So I'm exaggerating here a little bit. I hate to say that because I don't want to let the viewer off the hook. But it's very dangerous out there right now, and it's going to cause more disease, because what it's going to do is it's going to drive gay men to the point, and any sexual person, sexual women too, a gay, lesbian, straight, sexual woman, it's going to drive them into the closet, because as soon as you reveal your status to anybody, they can hold it against you and put you in jail. Anyway, so we can get off that now. I get very passionate about that, I realize, but to me it's a very sad. And so I'm just very angry that it's not on that list of why wouldn't this be a major, I mean, this will shut us up for sure. We'll be in jail. And the most radical of us will be in jail, because people who are sexual, who have sex with a lot of people who are promiscuous, will be prime targets for jail.
So I'm going to go on Scrooge for a second. And
Hold 1 second.
Oh, okay.
Change battery.
oh, we'll do that again. Okay. So I'm just going to put it out. I'll talk, and then you can give it thought. And then once we're ready to record, you can respond to it.
I only have 15 more minutes.
15 more minutes?
Whatever.
Maybe I won't go off script, just give me a second. I'm glad you said that so that I can just do a check on where we are here. So you got one more under dissension. You want to talk to this? Oh, okay, great. So just to end off dissension, the last question you chose here was, what is at stake? Is it important to be visibly queer, to be in open dissension of normalizing techniques, tactics, and if so, why?
Well, I would say yes. I would say generally, you know, as I said before, the middle of the road is where you get run over. Dissension is incredibly important. We live in a culture of sheep. We live in a culture that has been put to sleep by media and by computers and by your iPhone and your iPod and your whatever. And that's the way, you know, not to sound too conspiracy theorist, because I don't think people think this out, but it's just the way culture works. That's the way culture wants it, that we are asleep and watching our favorite videos, our favorite reality shows, and we're not thinking about things or trying to change anything, trying to change government, change our lives, because it doesn't serve business, doesn't serve money and corporations or the capitalism for us to be questioning. It serves democracy, but democracy and capitalism are two very different things. So, yeah, I think dissension on every level is very important, making people uncomfortable, not for the sake of it, but just that if you hold radical, important views, if you think about things, if you question things, you will upset people. And that's important and a positive thing.
Okay, thank you for that. That's great. So I did see on your page, you didn't pick any questions that are rights-based claims, troubling equality, but you had some notes there about that.
Well, I just felt that,
speak to that, you're welcome to.
I felt that, yeah, well, I mean, when it comes to rights, I basically think that, I've expressed the fact that when it comes to rights, I think that rights are, that we set too much store by rights. I'm going to say a perfect example would, because rights have gone, you can go crazy with rights. For instance, I don't know if you know, but it seems to me, unless I've got my information wrong, the latest UN human right is right to computer access. Now, on the one hand, I think that I agree that every person in this world, to be a person the way the world is now, really needs computer access and should have it. On the other hand, what is a right? Do you know what I mean? And my right competes with your right. You understand what I mean? And that's what's happening with the right wing right now. They're going, well, you may have a right to tell me, you may say that my religion cannot be homophobic, but I have freedom of religion, and the right of my religion is to be homophobic, because that's part of my religion. That's basically the debate. I think that's kind of an unsolvable debate. Like, my way of dealing with that debate is say, fundamentalism is problematic. Fundamentalism links up religion and government. They should be separate, right? That's the way I would deal with that. But I think that you still get into trouble around rights because people get into quibbling. It's almost like, I can't think of the term right now, but it's almost like when people start talking about, victim politics. It's almost like, you know, I'm a gay man, I'm more a victim than you, you're a lesbian, I'm more a victim than you as a disabled person, like who's the most victimized person? Well, rights are very similar, like whose rights are being abrogated here, let's just hurl rights at each other. And what I really think, and though I think it's great that gay people can be married, and certainly great that you're not allowed to have discriminate over jobs or accommodation, and of course we'd live in a horrible world if we didn't have those rights. On the other hand, there's all sorts of subtle forms of discrimination that happen to me every day and in my life, and it has nothing to do with anything rights-based. And in fact, rights are a way for the right wing to mask their homophobia and their prejudice, because they can say they've got their rights, that they have to stop complaining. So once we get our rights, once we get gay marriage, or the favorite thing from the right is, well, they've got gay TV shows now, so what are they complaining about, right? So, you know, so if I say I need a sexual space, or I say that, you know, my work isn't being published, or I say that I can't say this out loud, or if I say I can't teach this, or I can say whatever, shut up, you have your rights, right? And never mind, you're now abrogating someone else's rights. So it isn't the area of rights where we're going to find our liberation, basically.
Okay, great. Intersectionality. What do you think of identity politics?
Well, I think I've kind of covered this.
Yeah, you actually did that one. So, queer liberation is to learn from feminism, critical race theory, socialism, any of those examples?
Well, I mean, of course I think that I am a lefty queer person, and I think that being queer is always been associated with being the left-wing politics with me. Now, one of the ways in which I think, there is a reason for that, okay? One of the reasons why left-wing and queer are connected is because of promiscuity, okay? So on the one hand, you can't call the bathhouse, which is where I like to hang out, a democratic place because there's all sorts of body fascism going on, and even racism, of course, all sorts of things. And desire can be racist, for instance, and desire can certainly be body fascist. And I believe, personally, that desire can be racist and body fascist even without cultural intervention. In other words, I think some people may be born preferring to kiss black faces or white faces, or preferring to kiss, what was the thing I was talking about? Oh yeah, big tits or small tits or whatever. You do understand what I mean? I think that maybe that's inscribed when we're born and not culturally. But, so anyway, yes, in that sense, bathhouses, promiscuity, I'm using bathhouses as an example, are not democratic. On the other hand, they are incredibly democratic because I meet people every day in the bathhouse, some who I talk to more than others, but who I have interaction with, sometimes the most basic human interaction, who come from a completely different social sphere than I do. I have sex with street people, with drug addicts, with people who don't have jobs, with people who are working class, and I'm basically a middle class person. I'm sure I have sex occasionally with people who are very rich and out of my league. So it is, when it comes to class, and when it comes to race also, I probably have more interaction with people of other races sexually than I do in any other part of my life, right? So what I'm trying to say is that sex is, to some degree, sex, on the one hand, it may be fascist, but it's quite democratic in its fascism. There's a statement about sex. In other words, yes, people are very specific in what they want, but the great thing about sex is that everybody's different about what they want, right? So that old story, I never buy it when people go around saying, you know, I'm fat and nobody loves me. Well, there's a lot of people who want to have sex with quote unquote fat people or large people or whatever term you want to use. So you're not allowed to use that as an excuse. You know, you can always find a culture. That's the great thing about sex, is that, and people could say, oh, that's all about objectifying. Well, sex is about objectifying, in my view, in the sense that, yes, on the one hand, it's bad if we're sitting here having an interview and one of us is objectifying the other. But when it comes down to having sex with people, it's really about what you've got or what you haven't got, or what you've got too much of or not enough of, or whatever. You know, people want those kind of things. And so sex, the practicality of sex is really interesting. And it changes us, and it really transforms us in a positive way. And I think that one of the things which people from, so that's why fundamentally I think if you look at real liberation, which is related to sexual liberation in my view, it's going to be related to left causes, because to me left causes are all about class and difference, and recognizing that people who are different than us from class and from other reasons deserve the same as anyone. So I think that now, so of course I've always thought that I've never been a one-issue person. Like, I've always thought that I'm a feminist, and I don't know what you want to call me, but I'm a lefty and a feminist, and various other causes I have that are to me intimately connected with my queerness. And that was the old style. This is Genet style. This is old-fashioned. People don't talk like this anymore, so just remember that I'm an antique. But all of this stuff comes out of Genet and that kind of idea, because Genet thought that, you know, the blacks and the gays all over the world would unite and there'd be a world revolution. It didn't happen, but that's what he thought would happen. And the world would change because of the minorities who because of their difference, would cause change. On the other hand, when you mention all these groups, I think that they have a lot to learn from us. Because if I look at the NDP, I mean, my latest play, The Situationist, part of it was about how boring the left is and how unsexual the left is, and how sex would, if they started to come to terms with sex and think about sex, it might make the left more interesting and more vital and more human and more democratic. So I think that I think that all of the politics which you mentioned, when they separate themselves from sex and sexuality, get very boring. There's nothing more boring than a lefty or a feminist who is not sexual. There's nothing more boring about anybody who's not sexual, but particularly those people for some strange reason.
Okay. Okay, so to the final questions, under today and tomorrow, that theme, are there aspects of queer liberation that you consider to be detrimental or a disservice to the movement? Or did I not note that right?
No, I don't know if I answered it though. Yeah, I don't know if I think I've already talked about most of that, because what I was talking about here was the criminalization of HIV, but I'll try to answer it. Ask me the question. Oh, ask me that again.
Yep, it's, are there aspects of queer liberation that you consider to be detrimental or a disservice to the movement?
Well, when it comes to queer liberation, I think that from what I read online about the goals of queer liberation, if you have defined it, I have expressed where I think the faults lie. I think it needs to be more focused on sex and sexual liberation. And I think it also needs to be more, and I think it needs to move, it must acknowledge the necessity for human rights, but it must also acknowledge the fact that human rights are only the beginning of a gigantic job, which is to transform society and society's ideas, and that changing human rights may in fact set us back in terms of the way we may have to go through a period where people are very angry about us gaining our rights. That's the least awful situation I can think of, but that's very well already happening. It may happen before we're able to change society. So those are the two. I mean, I think queer liberation is great in every other way. I mean, I think that the only other danger, we had this danger around buddies, was that queer just becomes another word for different. So the definition becomes so expanded. That's why I think you have to accentuate sex, okay? Because if you don't accentuate sex, then being queer is just being different. Hey, I like to wear funny ties, I'm queer. You know, no, if you like to have sex while you're tied up with that tie, then you're queer. You understand what I mean? So that's the way that you kind of separate the men from the boys, or the girls from the women, or the whatever. Do you understand what I mean? Like you have to really have sex as a part of it, or else you end up, because at Buddies we start to expand it to being radical theater with queer theater, and to some degree that works, but then you end up with we didn't end up with them at Buddies because we were so sexual that people who weren't sexual didn't want to be involved with us when I was there, because they were just offended. But basically, if you put sex out there, then the people who are offended by that will not be involved in the movement, and that's fine. Because I don't think people who are unsexual, anti-sexual need to be involved in a queer movement. They need to be involved in the love movement or the understanding or the tolerance movement, but that's something quite different.
And just quickly going a bit off script on that, at least from Ontario's perspective, there is an inclusion of, say, the trans populations.
Mm-hmm.
And at least part of the trans populations emphasizes very strongly the issue of gender identity. It's
Yes.
less about sexual orientation or sex itself. It's about gender identity.
Well, I mean, I have my quarrels with the trans movement. I'll be as horrible as to say that. But one of the quarrels I have, I would quarrel with them if they, because to me, I understand what they're getting at. I think I understand what they're getting at, which is that they don't want, sexuality and gender to be tied together. Like at any cost, they want to say, I don't want this to be saying something about whatever gender I am. I don't want, or no gender. I don't want that to be saying something about my sexuality or suggest something about who I want to have sex with. I'm fine with that. But on the other hand, I think that if the trans movement is not about sex, I hate to say it, but they shouldn't be involved with the queer movement if that's not what they're about. To me, that's what queer is about. It's about sex. And there may very well be trans people who don't like sex, or are not interested in sex, and sex plays a little part of their life. Absolutely. Just like there are gay people like that. They shouldn't be involved with the queer movement either, right? Anybody who's not sexual or doesn't see sex as important, and because basically who we decide to have sex with has been the issue. That's why we're victimized. That's why we're tied to stakes in the Wyoming and brutally beaten, like Matthew Shepard. It's because of who we decide to have sex with. Interestingly, people, I mean, I know that I said that I thought gender was more important than sex at one point. Like, I remember, so I seem to be contradicting myself. And I'd say the two are very intertwined. But that's what I would say, is that they're intertwined. Not in the sense that every trans issue is a sex issue, but in fact, a lot of times when people talk about gender, it's in relationship to sex and sexuality. It's when it begins to stray from the norm of those two together, right? Or the suggestion of that. So anyway, all I can say is that I think it should be about sex. I would have to have a longer conversation about why trans people think that sex should not be a major issue. But I would say, nothing against trans people, I would just have a problem with anybody. I just don't understand people when sex isn't important to their lives, and I think they should be part of another movement. Because to me, to being queer has always been primarily because sex is important to me. Sex is a part of my life. I might not even be having it all the time because I'm old and I can't get it up, but, which is thankfully not that necessary in the gay community. But I am still, it's still a part of who I am, sex. It's important to me. It's how I identify myself. It's an important part of my life, and so I'm interested in that discussion. We don't have time to talk about it further. I'm very interested in talking about that more.
Okay. And the last question of your choice was, what do you see as the most important fronts of our movement going forward?
Well, I think that the most important issue facing queer people right now is the criminalization of HIV. And it's an issue around that is also contingent on race and sexuality, race and gender, okay? Because basically the heterosexual laws around the criminalization of HIV are racist. If you look at or the way they're being applied is racist. There's no laws, I guess, actually, but the way they're being applied is racist. If you look at Hamilton, the two people who've been put in jail in Hamilton are both not only black, but from Uganda and from the same part of Uganda. What's going on there? Is that just, I guess that's just a coincidence, right? I'd say no. I'd call that, there's some sort of institutionalized racism going on there. Number two, all of the criminalization, HIV criminalization is centered on protecting women, which means infantilizing women, right? Which means that women can't make choices for themselves. They can't tell their partners to use condoms. Now, on the one hand, it's important to recognize that heterosexism does make it difficult for women to tell men to use condoms. But in consensual sexual situations, we shouldn't be encouraging the government to take care of women. We should be encouraging women to take care of themselves and to empower themselves. And, you know, because it's very old-fashioned the way the government is treating these women in these situations. And I'm actually shocked that feminists haven't spoken up about it more, okay? So to me, when you're dealing with the criminalization of HIV, you're dealing with a very queer issue because it's involved with racism, feminism, and, you know, gay and lesbian politics.
And our last mandated question is, given the questions asked and the discussion we've just had, are there any further comments or thoughts you would like to share before we end the interview?
Well, I'm now late for my luncheon appointment, so I better say no, but I've talked a lot, so. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Scott.
You're welcome.
Really
It's
appreciate
fun.
that.